Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's online discussion and Q&A, the coronavirus pandemic, capitalism, socialism, and the struggle against the Johnson government. A special welcome to those guests who I can see are joining us internationally from Australia and from the United States as well. My name is Tom Scripps. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party and a writer for the World Socialist website. And with me today is Chris Marsden, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. Hello, Chris.
Hello there, Tom.
Chris, today we're going to be speaking and answering our viewers' questions about what is the most consequential world crisis in decades. We're living through truly unprecedented events. I think as of yesterday, according to the official statistics, over 160,000 people have been killed by the virus globally, over 15,000 of them in Britain. And we know that these numbers, which exclude the horrific toll being taken in care homes in country after country and in people's own homes, don't come close to the real figure. Beyond that, we know that thousands more are sick, many of them severely, and millions have lost their jobs or are being forced to endanger their lives and those of their families by being forced to work in unsafe conditions. How would you initially appraise the global situation as it stands?
That's a very good question, Tom. All of the things you say are correct. I think that it bears thinking about how this is presenting itself to billions of workers the world over. 2.5 million cases, and that is a massive underestimation. If you look at the news, you read any newspaper, certainly every one will have the latest outrageous statement by Donald Trump saying don't believe the Chinese and the Iranian figures. But the working hypothesis that workers and young people should adopt is don't believe any of them. You know, we're looking at a situation in which there is a systematic campaign of misinformation about what is taking place throughout the world. As Tom pointed out, we know, for example, that the statistics that are being reported only count deaths in hospitals, and that's, I think, the case with almost every country. They don't factor in care homes, and they certainly don't factor in the deaths at home of many, many, many more people, not just of coronavirus, but also the fact that people are very scared to go in hospital. People are being told to self-isolate. They're told that it would be socially irresponsible to place burdens on, say, in Britain, the National Health Service. And so people with very acute conditions who are placed under enormous strain are dying. And then, of course, that doesn't factor in the deliberate concealment that is taking place by governments that have got a lot to hide. So the figure of 2.5 million cases could easily double. That's the first thing. Secondly, if you're looking at the world situation, I think the most remarkable and salient issue is that there is absolutely no collaboration between any of the major states in dealing with this global pandemic. The European Union, for example, certainly leading German politicians, were recently forced to apologize to Italy for their failure to respond in any way to their desperate appeals when they were one of the first countries to be hit by the pandemic in Europe. But it was entirely cynical. You know, they just made this apology in order to keep the EU machine ticking. But all reports continue to be of a beggar thy neighbour policy pursued by every single major capitalist government, from the most immediate, such as the undercutting of one state by another in the desperate search for personal protective equipment, ventilators, etc., to a policy of funneling in literally billions, trillions, in fact, into the bank accounts and pockets of their corporations and banks as they all prepare for trade and military war. And this all takes place even as the impact of cuts are being felt in healthcare, elderly care, and across the board. The situation confronting the working class is life-threatening when it comes to the coronavirus. It's also their very livelihoods are on the line in a way that's not been seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and as many economists and major economic institutions are saying, is worse than the 1930s. In the United States, for example, at least one of the most concerned reports that was issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis said that the coronavirus outbreak could end up costing 47 million jobs. Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has estimated that on an unemployment rate in the United States of 47 million jobs lost. That's a rate of 32% compared with 25% during the Great Depression. It's not the only such estimate. For example, an estimate from the IMF and the World Bank that the disruption to the world economy is caused by COVID-19 is expected to wipe out 6.7% of working hours globally in the second quarter of this year. They rate that as equivalent to 195 million jobs worldwide. More than 4/5 of all workers globally are now living under partial shutdown measures. And when this all finishes, it's not going to go back to anything. There's no return to normalcy. Of course, there will be a massive drive to hike up the exploitation of the working class, but certainly many workers are not going to be called back into the workforce. And that is going to hit people extremely hard. For example, workers in the informal sector who are representing some 61% of the global workforce, 2 billion people, don't have any access to any benefits whatsoever. So they'll have no means of feeding their families if their jobs disappear. The International Labour Organization was asked this week whether how many people they thought were going to be unemployed, and all that they would commit to was that it will be significantly higher than the 25 million job losses they forecast last month. Just to put that in some sort of perspective, at this point in time, 190 million workers are unemployed around the world. Now, this situation is extremely explosive. There's going to be no return to normalcy. Once this pandemic is past, there will be two things. First of all, a massive campaign will be waged to secure market share around the world between the major capitalist corporations and companies. A very vicious and brutal trade war. All sorts of tensions will emerge. And the demand everywhere will be for the working class to pay for that by accepting national sacrifice, cutting their wages, cutting their jobs, cutting their conditions, working whatever hours are required in a way that is going to be so brutal that it cannot be envisaged that this will all take place without the resort to the most extreme forms of authoritarian rule and police state measures against broad masses of the population.
I think some of those points as well draw attention to the fact that as much as the disease itself is natural in origin, the evolution of a particular strain of the virus, the global crisis that it's become is social in origin. It builds on or is exploiting the gutted healthcare systems of country after country. And you pointed to the lack of solidarity across the European Union. Of course, the severe experience of the pandemic in some southern European countries is in considerable part a result of their destroyed healthcare systems, destroyed by austerity mandated by the institutions of that European Union. Perhaps you could speak a little, we could speak a little bit more about how we got here in Britain. As we said in the introduction, 15,000 dead. I think there's a recognition that steps could have been taken, ought to have been taken, that would have prevented it ever getting to this stage. Why wasn't this done, and what was done by the Johnson government?
Well, the situation is horrific in this country, absolutely horrific. The death rate in Britain is extraordinary. If you compare, it's the second highest death rate now after the United States. Something like, I think the last figures were 880 odd, compared with close to 2,000 in the United States. But you're dealing with a country there with a population much bigger, so the rate of death is so high, and little wonder. The picture is everything that I said about the global situation. You get that in spades in the UK. And the latest piece I've read, National Care Forum, have estimated that more than 4,000 elderly and disabled people have died across residential and nursing care homes. That compares with the official figure acknowledged of 217. Now, whether that's correct or not, you're dealing with a multiple factor of deaths. In addition, as a result of the failure to provide personal protective equipment, at least 86 health and social care workers are believed to have died as of yesterday morning of COVID-19. As well as that, obviously, we have a situation in which literally a million, I believe it's 1 million people applied for welfare benefits so far in the UK because they can't get by. That's across all sections of the population, living on 80% of their wages, and they're the fortunate ones because many people on 0 hours contracts are getting nothing, and they will be eking out an existence on minimal benefits. So this is a very desperate crisis. There are reports of 1.5 million people only having 1 meal a day because they cannot afford to eat, given the extreme. They were already in situations of extremis, and now they're in dire straits. And that's going to continue. You asked how we got there. Well, Britain was not the only country by any means, but it was the government which declared publicly that their strategy for COVID-19, and I use the words advisedly, was herd immunity. This was officially acknowledged by Sir Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, and he said that their working hypothesis was that you couldn't stop the spread of the coronavirus. So they were estimating that 60% of the population should catch COVID-19. And then once they recovered, they would acquire the necessary antibodies to protect the rest of the population as well. Now, everybody knew that this was not the case, but let's just run with it. He was asked at the time that would mean hundreds of thousands of dead. There were various estimations given, but he just basically replied that it was a very real possibility. It's a nasty disease. Then the public outrage began to be developed, and it certainly was echoed the scientific community, who said that to call this a herd immunity strategy is completely bogus. The only way that herd immunity strategies had previously been discussed is when there was a virus, because to develop a herd immunity strategy, it wasn't 60% of the population that would catch the disease, it was 90%. And moreover, this is a virus that nobody knew about, its full properties. There were massively varying estimations of how many people were going to die. And it's also a virus that has mutated. I believe, I'm not an expert on the science, but I believe there's at least 3 strains of it already. So this was a perspective for uncounted numbers of dead. Now, but yet, even in the face of all this outrage, it's just striking that the same policy was maintained for almost a fortnight afterwards. It means mounting outrage about what the government was doing. They kept to it. They really did. And I was, looking at the internet last night, and someone actually, I believe it was from the Squawk Box website, got some film of Boris Johnson in February. You know, if you want to know what was obsessing the government at that time, it was quite revealing. He has this video, and it was a meeting in Greenwich in which he was outlining Britain's disagreement with the European Union on EU-UK trade. And this is from the speech, which you can see him delivering it if you're that way inclined. Look at this seen individual. He says, "We are starting to hear some bizarre autarkic rhetoric when barriers are going up and when there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage. Then at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange. Some country ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of the populations of the earth to buy and sell freely, among others. And here in Greenwich in the first week of February 2020, I can tell you in all humility that the UK is ready for that role." So that's what he was concerned about. He wanted to be the Superman, the superhero of the free market. Now, there's a piece in the Sunday Times today, which, I mean, it's a lot of this material was well known, and certainly was well known to readers of the World Socialist website, but it was downplayed, even amidst the mounting opposition. But they point out in this article, the Inside team, that in that period, Johnson didn't attend 5 COBRA meetings, the emergency meetings of the government to discuss the coronavirus crisis, because he was either on holiday or at Chequers. And they quote a senior advisor to Downing Street, and he says he liked his country breaks. He didn't work weekends. It was exactly like people feared he would be. That's Johnson. Now, in the meantime, there were all calls to order protective gear were ignored, and all the warnings by numerous scientists fell on deaf ears. And the government just proceeded on its herd immunity strategy, even allowing people to go to the Cheltenham races and make bets, handing over coins to bookies. And it wasn't until March the 2nd, that's fully 5 weeks, that Johnson attended a meeting of the COBRA committee. And they also point out that contrary to the official position, Britain was in an absolute mess when it came to preparation for the pandemic. There'd been no buying of emergency stockpiles of PPE, and instead they'd been allowed to go out of date and were never replenished. There was no training, and no measures were put on in place of any form of contingency planning, because they just were not interested. Now, they also point out, just to show how completely indifferent they were, and I'm not raising this in the same way the Sunday Times did, but they actually sold PPE to China. You know, this was not their policy. Of course, China and many countries were considering how to protect their citizens. The Johnson government just wanted to make some money. Now, they also pointed out that, I mean, just amongst the warnings, Southampton University, for example, they said they calculated that 190,000 people flew into the UK from Wuhan and other Chinese cities during that period. They were completely aware of the dangers, and they were completely indifferent. But it's much worse, than, as we know, as every reader of the World Socialist website knows, it's much worse, because this wasn't what they decided in January or December or even February. This was all decided years ago in 2016, because they'd had that Operation Cygnus, which was a sort of a wargaming strategy for preparation for a COVID-19 style pandemic. And their working hypothesis from that point on was that the NHS would collapse. It would collapse, that they wouldn't have enough PPE, they wouldn't have enough intensive care ventilators, and that people would die. I mean, the Telegraph today has actually cited some figures which I haven't seen before, but this is what they say. And bear in mind, this is the Sunday Telegraph. This is the Tory house organ that Boris Johnson wrote for, quite lucratively. And this is their words: Britain assumed a deadly virus would inevitably cripple the NHS and kill up to 750,000 people. That was their working hypothesis when this all began. When Patrick Vallance was speaking about herd immunity, whatever figures they were putting on it, the most serious guesstimate by professionals at that time was 750,000 people dying in the UK from a coronavirus style disease. And they quote a Whitehall official, and this is what he says: everything we planned for was based on the idea that a disease would kill lots and lots of people. We didn't spend a lot of time exploring how we would prevent it in the first place. Instead, we looked at how we could build up mortuary space and intensive care beds after it had already spread. That's the government policy. That's what they were doing. And once this comes out, and once all this pans out, it's not that people will be clapping for Boris. They will be demanding his head, because he has committed high crimes and misdemeanors against the British working class and against the working class all over the world.
And of course, to add to it, fundamentally the same policy or the same conceptions that underline it are in place today and are driving what we've labeled the Back to Work campaign that's now in action all across the world. The idea that within a relatively short period, with no measures really taken to seriously suppress, let alone eradicate, the threat posed by the disease, workers will be sent back to their factories, back out onto the streets to continue producing profits of the major corporations. And that ultimately this initial period of lockdown is not intended to create the space in which a serious program of testing and contact tracing and all of the things that the World Health Organization has said is necessary to actually combat the disease. It's not been to put these measures in place. It's been to give them some time to work out how they can get the working class back to producing profits. And obviously there will be problems with that. But we've drawn attention to this campaign on the World Socialist website. We noted that, of course, there was, as you've mentioned, a significant stock market crashes all over the world when this pandemic first, the virulence of it first became apparent. And then within, I forget the exact time period, but within a few days, you noticed that suddenly there was a sudden rush, a sudden uptick in the world stock markets. And that this was because the governments had announced their bailout packages. The major corporations knew that, just like in 2008, 2009, there's no real risk involved past a certain level of doing business. The governments were going to bail them out, and they knew that this money would be secured by the working class being sent back into the factories under unsafe conditions. Perhaps there's more you can say on what is involved in the Back to Work campaign and some of the examples perhaps from other countries in the world.
Well, yes, Back to Work campaigns, it's universal. I mean, apart from country Sweden, which has never had any lockdown, and there are warnings now from medical professionals in that country saying this will have an apocalyptic effect in the long term. There is not a country in the world which is now not actively engaged in a back to work strategy. We've cited Donald Trump. You know, he's basically his latest tweets were saying, "Make no mistake, this is my policy. I might be discussing with the the heads of the governors of various states, but I am determined to get America back to work again. He's even reached out to these far-right protesters organized by InfoWars and sites such as that, militia types, saying that, you know, this is about freedoms. America's got, this is what America is all about. You know, this is all about work. The economy's got to get going. Perhaps less, with less bellicosity. That is the position which is being pioneered in Spain. In this instance, involving a government of the Socialist Party in Podemos, a pseudo-left tendency that was one of the great hopes of the international radical fraternity. They're pulling it. They did a breakdown in The Guardian, for example, of all the states in Europe that were implementing measures sometime between late April, mid-May, including getting the schools back together, getting non-essential workers back to work, so on and so forth. Schools very important. And they did this just to make how clear. They accompanied this with a graph of how much they thought the hit to their economies was going to be if that didn't take place. So economics versus life. As we point out, capitalism means death, and the working class fighting against this is in a struggle for life. I mean, it's that naked, that brutal. What's striking for me is just how dangerous that is for the Johnson government. I mean, here's a strange thing, that the government that was most open about the herd immunity strategy is having some of the biggest difficulties going back to it. Now, it's not because they won't do it, because they will. In fact, all of the discussion, all the papers this morning were all filled with leaks about what the back to work strategy would be. And it involves, in typical, you know, soundbite fashion, red, amber, green, like a series of traffic lights. And red is get the schools back. Now, of course, this was all prepared. You know, apparently there's no threat from schools. You know, we really overestimated the danger of the children of adult parents mingling together in school and then coming home on public transport. And this is going to have statistically no impact on the coronavirus. It probably wasn't even good to do it in the first place. This is a sort of rewriting that's taking place. The amber policy is all non-essential workers back to work, and everything apart from some pubs and restaurants, which will then be phased in a few weeks after that. And the green is when, for a period, you would have to cocoon the older end of the population in care homes and at home. And that might take at least another year before they will be allowed to rejoin this great society. So in actual fact, from an economic standpoint, there's only two parts of this strategy, red and amber. Because green is their attitude to the aged and the infirm has already been made apparent, which is, to hell with you, you can just die where you're put. I mean, the herd immunity strategy, as we pointed out, has taken on the character of a cull. To cull those that are not considered profitable. Now, what's the driving force for this? Well, we've written on it, and I strongly urge all our readers who've not studied them with due care and attention to study the two perspectives written by David North on this issue, and the one in today's Saturday's edition of the World Socialist website. But this was a deliberate policy, a conscious policy. In the United States, trillions were, they spent their time, this was a crisis that was coming, and they wanted to funnel massive amounts into the pockets of the super rich, and they did it. That was what they were concerned with. That's what the meetings were about. Same in Britain, 350 billion, and that's a down payment. All these things were done with no opposition. In the UK, not even with a token opposition from the Labour Party. And now they want people to get back to work. And whatever the problems are, the issue for them is how do you create the best conditions for doing it? I mean, they're speaking about Boris Johnson coming back. There's a headline in the Daily Telegraph, Boris takes control or some such nonsense. The same with the Daily Mail. They're saying that we couldn't do this without Boris. Who are they kidding? I mean, do they really believe that Boris Johnson has popular standing in the country? I mean, it's more the case that they're worried about the political response, and they don't want to be the person on the being targeted for future retribution for what they're about to do. But this is what they're discussing, and the dates, only the dates. They're saying, when do we do the schools? 3 or 4 dates are being put forward, and then after that, when do we do the next stage? When do the next stage? Sooner or later, they're going to go back. And this is after epidemiologists have said and acknowledged, and government sources have acknowledged, that they're not speaking about simply a second wave of the coronavirus. They're speaking about a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and an eighth wave of the coronavirus. So they're speaking about deaths for a long time to come.
In fact, just to carry on. No, well, to underline that point, I mean, we quoted it in an article on the World Socialist website, the deputy medical officer of the Home Office in a leaked internal call in that department in relation to the sending back to work of, I think it was 2,000 office workers in the passport department of the Home Office. And this deputy medical officer, Rupert Shute, was quoted as saying, "It's perfectly okay to carry on around your business, and it's vitally important that you do so, as there's a whole bunch of supply chains and the economy that needs to continue running. I keep coming back to this point that we are all going to get this coronavirus at some point. We can't hide away from it forever, but we can manage the way in which we are exposed. It's certainly not something we're going to be able to squash and eliminate." And then he carries on to say, "Talk for the moment is around a peak and managing the current outbreak. This doesn't mean there isn't going to be a second, third, fourth, fifth, or even more peaks. As we go into many months and many years, we're going to have to get used to a different way of living with this at home and at work." And that was a long time after the policy of herd immunity had officially been dropped, and a long time after all of these warnings had been made by leading eminent epidemiologists, rubbishing that as a strategy, which, as you rightly said, is no strategy at all. I thought you made an interesting point about the idea that somehow Boris Johnson is the man who needs to be at the wheel to save British capitalism. I mean, in fact, in other circles, the argument that's beginning to be developed is that really what's going to be necessary at a later stage in this crisis is the development of a government of national unity, and that in fact the new leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, is going to be the man who has the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders. And lo and behold, it's the Labour Party who has made really its sole criticism of the government over the coronavirus pandemic the fact that there isn't an exit strategy, that there isn't a back to work plan. I mean, how would you assess Labour's role in this crisis?
Well, I'd agree with everything you just said, Tom, but with one proviso, that this is not down the line, this is now. The Daily Mail today, in its report, its front page was something like "Get Britain Moving." And they speak about the fact that there is already a grand coalition emerging of senior political figures, both from the Tory party, business, but with the most prominent role being played by Sir Keir Starmer, who's meeting with the likes of David Davis and Ian Duncan Smith, who've been identified as the most bellicose in the get back to work strategy. Now, of course, Starmer's doing his usual stuff and nonsense about this is all about getting this discussion out in the open and being accountable, but that's all lies, transparent lies. What he's basically putting himself forward as is the spokesperson, the front man for a get back to work strategy, in which he will claim he'll be bleeding crocodile tears from every pore about the fate of the worker. When it's just, this is all about the profits of big business. They have to claw back as much money, as much profit as possible out of the backs of the working class, no matter what the cost, no matter how many people die. Now, it was interesting. You had New Statesman. They've endorsed it. Why does Keir Starmer keep banging on about an exit strategy? He says he's written a letter to Dominic Raab asking again that ministers publish an exit lockdown strategy. Now, he was talking earlier on, and we wrote on it. The first thing he spoke about was the possibility of a coalition government. He even gave an interview to Robert Peston on the BBC, and he said, don't know yet, but we're certainly not going to be the ones to criticise the government. We're going to be very positive and proactive, etc., etc., etc. But it might not be the time to join a coalition government. Well, here's the thing. Without any discussion, we've already got a coalition government. There is no difference whatsoever between the Labour Party and Johnson's government on any fundamental issue with respect to the coronavirus crisis, except for one, and that is when Sir Keir Starmer commits himself to the most right-wing elements within the most right-wing government Britain's ever seen. That's what's taking place. And none of it is meeting a shred of opposition from the Labour left. Nothing. In fact, I didn't even see it. I didn't see it until this morning. But for instance, Corbyn has pledged his loyalty to Sir Keir Starmer, even as his acolytes have revealed the fact that there was a massive systematic campaign to purge him and tens of thousands of Labour Party members from the party on the basis of trumped up accusations of anti-Semitism. Even after that, he pledged his loyalty to Sir Keir Starmer, and he was interviewed in Al Jazeera on the coronavirus crisis, and it was like business as usual. He says, the quotes, I just couldn't believe these quotes because they were so. He says, the coronavirus crisis has emphasized just how unequal our planet is, how unequal our societies are in the USA, Britain, and Europe, and many other parts of the world. After the coronavirus, it can never be the same again. The impact is globally is different in different places. The impact is on the poorest communities is the greatest. The world is going to be a different place post-COVID, and it cannot be a global retrenchment and global austerity. It's got to be that we recognise health inequalities are a danger to everyone. Even the well-off and healthy are in danger of health inequalities. We will have a more inclusive society in future. So he begins by saying there's massive inequalities that have been revealed by the coronavirus crisis. And he closes by saying even the well-off and healthy are in danger because of that. And we're going to have a more inclusive society. Amen.
As Her Majesty said.
There is nothing coming from the left. They've got nothing to say. What's very clear is Sir Keir Starmer is the leader that they wanted. They're all working with him now. They were forced to put on a show of opposition because of the massive hostility to Blairism, to New Labour, to austerity and militarism that erupted in 2015. And they've spent the next 5 years demobilising it and preparing for business as usual, but not under unusual circumstances. What Corbyn has done is fashion a vehicle led by Sir Keir Starmer that is now getting ready to take its place alongside the Tories in political, social and economic warfare against the British working class. That's what he...
And their allies in that fight have, of course, been the trade unions, who have, I mean, you made the point to me the other day that one has to continually be reminded that the Trade Union Congress exists because it has so little impact in the current situations, other than, of course, to, again, with the proviso, demobilize opposition that does develop in the working class. I mean, we've written quite extensively on the remarkable situation in Royal Mail with regard to the Communication Workers Union, the CWU, which going into this pandemic had been organising a ballot for strike action that had already been called off twice before, had been demobilised in the face of a very reactionary, anti-democratic High Court injunction. That ballot came in with a yes vote for strike action of something over 95%, at which point the CWU immediately cancelled it, in effect, and offered their membership up as an additional emergency service for, not for the working class, but for Boris Johnson's government and, quote, the nation. That's been rattling on for 2 weeks or so now. It's become very, very clear that their fraudulent olive branches to the or fraudulent appeals to the employer to implement some form of safety measures in the workplace have fallen on deaf ears. And the union continue to refuse even to mention the word strike or the phrase industrial action. And we're now seeing the very, very severe consequences of that. I know at least 3 post workers have died already officially. I'm sure the number's much higher, some 20%, I think it's 26,000 are self-isolating at home, either sick themselves or having to look after family members. And many, many, many of those, there aren't figures, but are not gaining access to any sort of financial support in this period. I believe the Royal Mail has said that if you're ill yourself, you require a doctor's note to say that you've got the coronavirus to receive any sort of additional sick pay, which anyone who knows anything about the conditions of testing and the availability of healthcare or an appointment with a doctor will recognize for the cynical gesture that it is. And if there's nothing available to people who are staying at home to look after families, loved ones, and friends. I mean, this is obviously not unique to that industry. It's perhaps most naked in there, but perhaps you could speak also, we know we've encountered similar, obviously in the health unions and the transport unions. It's a similar situation for London bus workers, for example.
Well, that's true, Tom. I just, for anybody who's not aware, you wrote an article at the beginning of this, Farrago with the communication workers, massive vote for strike action, and they said that they weren't, not only were they not going to implement it, they were going to offer up the postal workers as a 5th emergency service. Now, since that time, 9 officers, might be 10 depots have gone out in unofficial action because there's no protection. I mean, you're not talking about minor things, you're talking about no hand sanitizers, no gloves, no masks,
no hot water,
no changing working practices, no toilet facilities. People go out to work after mingling with fellow workers, and then they come into regular contact with the public. Their lives are in danger, nothing. And you wrote that article. You wrote an article, and actually got posted by a postal worker on Royal Mail Chat. And I believe today it's got close to 2,000 viewings. That's one of our articles. If you take the last 5 or so, I think we've got something like 6,500, 7,000 readings. Amongst a site that's basically dedicated to postal workers, you've got 110,000 postal workers in this country. So that's a heavy readership. And the vitriol that was leveled against you was extraordinary. I mean, you are an evil man. But the desperation of it is indicative of the role that they're playing. And there's no unions which are any different. That's the role of the unions all over the world. You know, every action, that, as far as I can see, I might have missed a few, but it's generally the action that's been taken by the working class has been taken in a rebellion against the trade unions. A long time before Keir Starmer was speaking about a government of national unity, the TUC was already meeting with the government to support its strategy. So yes, what I said to you, I maintain, you know, sometimes you have to remind yourself that the trade unions exist, but they do exist, and behind the scenes, their entire role is the suppression of the class struggle. You know, because that is the fundamental issue. None of this would have unfolded in the way that it is outside of the role of the labour and trade union bureaucracy and their lackeys in the pseudo-left groups. All of the preparation for what is now unfolding, the terrible catastrophe confronting the working class, was laid down by the labour and trade union bureaucracy, suppressing the class struggle. Jeremy Corbyn was given a golden opportunity to do something which he was never had any intention of doing. And everybody, there was an entire machinery to lie to the working class, to say that this represented a golden opportunity to transform the Labour Party into a vehicle for fighting austerity, militarism and war. And the net result of that is not simply Keir Starmer sitting in Labour Party HQ. The net result is Boris Johnson, his criminal policy, and the deaths of thousands of working people. That's the price which is paid by the working class for the continued domination of the labour and trade union bureaucracy. And that's why, as we said, the Labour Party would never recover from the Corbyn experiment, because the big myths have already been exploded. The idea that anything could be achieved through the Labour Party is dead in the water. And the working class is going to start looking for a genuine socialist alternative under conditions in which its very lives are on the line.
We just had a comment on the video which points out, in relation to what we were saying about the Royal Mail, which says, our local post worker said his base was so tiny and squashed and Victorian, in his words, it was impossible to maintain safe distance and they only had gloves for protection. I mean, it's that widespread that you can mention it and someone's got a story about it. I was fortunate enough to participate in a rank and file meeting of an independent committee of post workers in Australia, where the situation with the pandemic is not as developed as it is in Britain. Obviously, it's still a major concern. And it's, as many of these as you participate in, it's always striking how similar the issues that come up are. I mean, it's always the case that a worker in one industry in one country can be dropped into the same industry in any other country and immediately strike up a conversation about the same sorts of issues. I mean, it was, again, the fact that no real social distancing is allowed to take place. Of course, like everywhere else in Australia, post workers are twice as busy as they are, as individuals like Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, and the rest rake in the billions in the context of this pandemic and the confinement of billions to their homes. Post workers there as well in individual workplaces were given no information about the spread of the virus throughout workplaces. There are lies told that there have been no cases, or that if there have, the depot has been cleaned. And the union there as well make absolutely no effort to inform workforces across different depots of the situation. They don't only isolate between industries, but between workplaces. And even I heard one story of not letting the next shift know that someone had fallen ill on the shift before. The union rep was on the early shift, left, and didn't think it was necessary to tell the workers coming in afterwards that obviously there could be a danger of infection. I think that writing as well, and the response that you mentioned to our post workers articles, demonstrate that all that you said about Corbyn and Labour is true, and that crucially it is not a reflection of some sort of lack of willingness of the working class to fight, or some lack of recognition of what's going on. In fact, we've seen when we directly address the working class and ask them to write in with their experiences and address the issues that they're facing, that we get a mass response. And in fact, you know, as you know, the World Socialist website, our various forms of communication have seen a dramatic increase in their readership and in the sort of interaction that we're seeing with key sections of the working class.
Well, I think, you know, we can speak about that, and it's an important issue. I just wanted to raise one other question of what the World Socialist website represents and what the situation is in the working class. I mean, we were sent in a letter from a health worker, a nurse, at the is it Royal Brighton? I can't remember what it's actually.
Bournemouth.
Royal Bournemouth, sorry. And he just detailed the situation. It was just horrific, because he was working in a COVID ward, he or she, and he just spoke about the lack of PPE, the terrible hours, the conditions, etc. And it went viral for us. 80,000 viewings the last time I looked for that article, taken up hundreds of times on Facebook and other social media. Workers coming in and say, this is what it's like, this tells it like it is. There was a sort of put-up attack on it by someone who says, I am a frontline worker, I am not a manager, this is not a lie, and everything you say is untrue, and everything is rosy. There's a rosy glow over everything to do with it, and we're just applying the advice of the government as if that is a defence. And then there was just one attack on him after another. This Mr. Anonymous who wrote in to attack the article. But it's everywhere. I mean, it's on the buses. There's taxi drivers. There was a report. I'm sorry, I don't have his name in front of me. There's one taxi driver who was an immigrant, an Uber driver, and he died at home because he was afraid to go into the hospital. They're now saying that many immigrants are dying because they're scared to go into the NHS, and there's been an appeal not to investigate them. You know, that if someone falls ill, however, even if they just fall ill and they're in this kind of a job, there's an enormous pressure not to acknowledge it, because you will not work again. I mean, this is a catastrophe, and it's a deliberate policy. And to return to what we're saying, all of this was known. All of this was factored in. There are no surprises. They were told how many people would die, and they said it's a price worth paying. In fact, they've conducted this is an official policy. Just to reverse roles, because you've been asking me questions and so on and forth, but you wrote quite extensively on the relationship between this government and the notions associated with eugenics, including policies of the elimination of the sick, the infirm, and the supposedly genetically inferior. And really, this is the most graphic demonstration that policy was not a backroom interest, you know, some quirks among certain Tories, but it has informed official government policy. Would you like to say anything on that, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, wherever it comes up, it's always, as you say, it's presented in the corporate media as some sort of quirk or oddball that somehow found their way into the halls of power. And what we drew attention to is the fact that there was a clear pattern of this. It takes different forms. The most naked was, of course, the appointment of a man called Andrew Sabisky to the position of special advisor to the government, a man who had previously directly advocated eugenic type policies and who held the view that is quite common amongst particularly senior members of the Tory party, that intelligence in particular is ultimately overwhelmingly genetic, and that frankly we just have to acknowledge the fact that there is a vast difference in the natural capabilities, which are unalterable in this argument, between different human beings, and the vastly terribly unequal society that we see is a reflection of that fact. Johnson gave a speech some years ago to that effect. Dominic Cummings authored a paper Cummings is Johnson's chief special advisor. He authored a paper when he was advising Michael Gove when he was education secretary, essentially arguing that a rounded education for working class children was pointless because the fact that they were working class represented their inferior genetic stock. And it reaches the vicious level of a Tory prospective parliamentary candidate referring to people on a programme that looks at people on social security and commenting on social media that these people need putting down, all the way over to Jacob Rees-Mogg, the sort of house aristocrat of the Tory party, commenting that he and his interviewer would have been more likely to survive the horrific Grenfell Tower fire because they had the common sense to do so, by implication, of course, meaning that the residents themselves didn't, the poor residents didn't. I mean, to understand the role that it plays, you've got to recognize, I think, that historically eugenics and the broader ideology which accompanies it of social Darwinism, i.e. that the strong survive and prosper, and that's the way it should be, have always come to the fore when the class struggle has reached a particular pitch of high intensity. I mean, it initially emerged in the late 1800s, really as a direct answer to the rising socialist movement, which was gaining a mass audience in the working class. I mean, when Marxism explained the origins of poverty and inequality in the exploitation of the working class and of global inequality and imperialist oppression, social Darwinism basically answered that no, these inequalities you see are the product of different qualities of human being, different grades of human being. It's in that sense a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-philosophical justification for social inequality under capitalism and its most abhorrent consequences in terms of shortened lives and generally oppressed lives. It flows from the socioeconomic interests of the capitalist class. And you can see that process in motion today very, very clearly. You know, the Johnson government were determined, as you've explained, to ignore the pandemic, to continue running business as usual, to keep profits flowing and to prevent money, financial resources being diverted from their rightful owners in the ruling class to public health measures and public health resources. And to do so, they leaned on the ideological support or crutch, which is provided by any number of newspaper columnists, right-wing newspaper columnists or academics who see that their services are needed, who provide what is presented as a moral argument that some people matter less, and more than that, that really it's moral that the weak shuffle out of the way in society. This is always advanced behind the sort of smiling, benevolent face, which in this case is saying that society as a whole needs to confront the reality of death, that we need to put more attention into end-of-life care, even more nakedly as, has anyone asked the elderly if they actually want, in essence, to carry on living? And obviously there's all sorts of legitimate points about dignity in later life. That's not the concern that's motivating these arguments. What it's essentially saying and arguing is that past a certain point, life, the continuation of life, is really unnatural. And how is that certain point to be determined? It's to be determined by the amount of wealth and therefore of healthcare resources that a particular individual can command. It comes back full circle to the justification of social inequality.
But they're actually now, you know, that if most people were asked to sum up, for example, the philosophy of social Darwinism, it would, you know, taking Darwin's findings from the theory of evolution and bastardizing it to this statement, survival of the fittest. But that's the official policy now.
Absolutely.
You know, they've released that those guidelines for who's supposed to get treatment, haven't they? Whether it's for ventilation, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, rather than having the conversation about how we move the vast amount of resources that exist in society to where they're needed, to providing adequate healthcare for everyone, moving out of the billionaire class and into public healthcare. The conversation is about, and the philosophers are summoned and the ethicists are summoned to discuss how we apportion and ration healthcare on the basis of what is a system of ranking life, and of bean counting about what the value of a human life is. There's this line that keeps coming out, we mustn't let the cure be worse than the disease, i.e. these lockdowns mustn't be allowed to so terribly impact economic life, that they cause, as they put it, more deaths than the disease itself. Now, of course,
which is the statement that's highlighted in this weekend's perspective from Roger Cohen, I believe from the New York Times.
Absolutely.
And there's an innumerable citations in that piece, isn't there, which make very clear that the ideas of very far-right conceptions associated with fascism are now re-emerging with full force within substantial sections of the bourgeoisie and its ideologues. I mean, for instance, not many people, because this caused something of a crisis and they dropped it very quickly. But it wasn't just the pensioners and the age that were saying they weren't going to get treatment. They also did the same thing for people with like Down syndrome and with serious illnesses. They were also going to be sacrificed, weren't they? I mean, this is the sort of stuff that's associated with the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. That what did Hitler call them? The empty eaters.
Absolutely. And the 1930s is the last time in which 1930s and 40s in which these ideas were brought to their full and terrible conclusions. And it wasn't, although it was carried furthest and most terribly in the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, it wasn't the sole preserve of the German ruling class. The ideas were really first developed in Britain and were given their first mass implementation in the United States, with programs of mass sterilization used to justify the exclusion of immigrants, mainly from, I believe, Eastern Europe and Asia, from the United States, on the basis that ultimately these people couldn't provide an economic benefit to the United States. It was universal in the ruling class, and it's never gone away. It had to go, it was sent to the shadows after the reaction to the horrors of the Second World War forced it to do so. But it's always lingered there, and it's been preserved by enough wealthy benefactors, ready to be brought to the fore again when class relations reach such a pitch and the interests of the working class and the ruling class are so diametrically opposed that this sort of fascistic argument needs to be developed, needs to be brought out of their arsenal.
Well, that's the key question. I mean, why do these things re-emerge? Because social tensions, so class antagonisms have indeed reached a fever pitch. And it's not what's happening now. It's, ideologically, this is extraordinary. All of the social nostrums that justified the profit system are being blown up, rather than capitalists taking the risks and getting the rewards for their enterprise. They're just sucking money out of society, being handed it over by governments which they control, so that the billionaires and trillionaires and figures which people can't even comprehend become increasingly wealthy, the Jeff Bezoses of this world, whereas everybody else is just on a downward spiral into poverty and destitution. So the whole society, it can't defend life, it can't offer a job, it can't offer any security, your home's in danger, the health service in danger, your children don't get educated, you won't get a pension. I mean, they're now speaking about getting rid of the triple lock, for example, on the pension, because we can no longer afford it. So everybody's pensions is just going to be eroded to nothing. If you ever get to become a pensioner, anymore. I mean, that's a thing of the past, because now you should be prepared to die early and die in pain. So this is where we're at. And then these ideological nostrums that were put to one side in the post-war period after that horrific experience of fascism, everything, the terrible things which happened, 60, 70 million dead, the Holocaust, and all of that, never again, none of that would emerge again, and yet now it does. One right-wing government after another coming to power, and all of the ideological filth of the past re-emerging with full force, directed against the working class. And all of that also, I think this should be understood, because the new normal is what we're speaking of now. And what will that new normal be? It will be the most brutal forms of exploitation imposed upon tens and hundreds of millions of working people by a class who's now celebrating conceptions which were absolutely impermissible for a whole period, that were confined to the fringes of society. There's really nothing different between what is being said in official government circles than what used to come out of these small scattered fragments of fascist tendencies all over the world. They're being elevated into the center of political discourse, political life, because that's a warning for what the working class has got to confront.
Yeah, and I think on that point, we're running up to halfway or so. I'd just like to draw our viewers' attention to the opportunity to donate that's being put up on the screen now. Unfortunately, funds aren't automatically allocated to political movements in line with the scale of their political tasks, and we'll get on to what our program is in the second part of this meeting. Our ability to do our work comes from the support and the self-sacrifice of workers and young people who recognize the burning necessity of what it is we've set out to and have to achieve, especially in the conditions of this pandemic and global crisis, which on the one hand bring countless new challenges, and on the other interrupt for the time being your ability to as it were, physically lend us support. A financial contribution, and if at all possible, a regular contribution and donation becomes all the more vital to us. If you agree with the analysis you've heard so far here today, if you've been following particularly the World Socialist website for some time and recognize the necessity for the building of an independent mass internationalist party of the working class, represented by ourselves, the Socialist Equality Britain, and in Britain and our sister parties elsewhere, then do please consider what donation and contribution you can make. Follow the link that's on the screen now. Just to restart the discussion, I mean, we're getting a few questions on this point, and we mentioned Sir Keir Starmer earlier, of course, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, a role in which he played a criminal role in the persecution of the current political prisoner and the most significant journalist of the 21st century, Julian Assange. There are all manner of concerns that flow from the current situation in British prisons for his health, in addition to all of the other concerns that were already attendant to that trial. Would you like to speak a bit about particularly perhaps the campaign that the Socialist Equality Party has waged over Assange and the dangers that are now posed to his life in so many ways?
Well, I think it is striking that the campaign for Assange's freedom, which we were the only political tendency that consistently fought for that. I mean, obviously there was, many people fought in defense of Julian Assange for a whole period, but from a consistent socialist standpoint, we were alone. He was completely betrayed and abandoned by the pseudo-left tendencies the world over from 2012 onwards, and even then they were somewhat ambivalent towards him. And he was abandoned by the social democrats, the trade union apparatuses all over the world, and nowhere more so than in the UK. I mean, the Labour Party has played a key role in isolating Assange and delivering him into the terrible predicament that he now finds himself in Belmarsh maximum security prison after decades of imprisonment, isolation in the Ecuadorian embassy. After years in the Ecuadorian embassy, with his health terribly compromised, his immune system terribly compromised, and with a lung condition, which is the worst possible condition to have with the coronavirus pandemic, and under conditions now in which coronavirus has proved to be not just rampant throughout the prison system, but within Belmarsh maximum security prison, amongst both prisoners and staff, in which Assange is being kept in there by a vindictive judicial system, despite the fact that he has no charges against him. In fact, they argued that Judge Vanessa Barrett's has said that he wouldn't be released when others were being released because he's not serving a sentence. I mean, it was truly Orwellian statements were being made. And he cannot be freed. Now, as we wrote at the time, that what conclusion could be drawn from this? Because they want him dead. They want Assange dead. And if they don't kill him in Belmarsh, they want nothing to stand in the way for his being extradited to the United States, to be silenced forever, to face charges that carry a sentence of 175 years in prison. Now, what was our campaign? Our campaign was not simply to fight for Assange's freedom, but to offer a way that that freedom could be secured against simply moral appeals, or least of all, appeals for a change of heart from Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, the trade unions, Amnesty International. As we said, if you're going to free Assange, you have to understand why he's imprisoned. He's imprisoned because he alerted broad layers of the working class and young people to imperialist war crimes. And they decided to silence him. And whatever excuses were put by the trade unions, by the Labour Party, by the pseudo-left tendencies, generally which focused on the regurgitation of the lies that Assange had committed some sort of sexual crimes in Sweden, when everyone knew that this was a frame-up. The real reason why they wouldn't defend Julian Assange is because they were defenders of imperialism and apologists for its war crimes. The pseudo-left tendencies, for example, were supporters of wars which WikiLeaks had exposed. Events one can cite Libya and Syria as examples in which they were advocates for the so-called opposition movements that were exposed in various leaks by WikiLeaks. And even more than the identity politics which they utilized to isolate Assange, that was the underlying reason for it. They were politically opposed. They're a pro-imperialist tendency. And it's the same with Corbyn. Corbyn, in his cups, and certainly before he became Labour leader, said that he opposed what was taking place, the victimisation of Julian Assange. But as soon as he became Labour leader, and it meant actually challenging, for example, the Blairites and opposing their pro-war agenda, because that's the only way that you could free Julian Assange, then a wall of silence descended. And now, once he's no longer the leader, he makes a few statements for the record and then resumes his long silence. The same with John McDonnell and the rest. And this is under conditions where Assange's life is in danger. It really is in danger. So our campaign has been a political campaign to mobilize the only social force that can defeat imperialism, which is the working class. And we're going to continue that. And in the coronavirus crisis, and the world that will follow the coronavirus crisis, because make no mistake, there will be a return to work, and life will resume with all of the dangers that brings with it, including the threat to life. Then the issue of Julian Assange will emerge with renewed force as part of a developing movement of the international working class for socialism. Because he represents, his fate represents the fate which imperialism has in store for anyone that opposes its crimes. And all of the tendencies that sought to denigrate and isolate Assange have themselves been discredited. Discredited, by what they did to him, and no one should ever forget it, and no one should ever forgive it, but also by what they're going to do in the political struggles that are now on the agenda. The Labour Party, all the Corbyn flim-flam has gone, and the Labour Party has revealed what it always was, a pro-imperialist tendency, that he's going to be working with the Tories directly against the working class. And no one outside of the willfully mendacious will put forward the Labour left, the Jeremy Corbyns of this world, or Rebecca Long Bailey, God help us all, as an opposition tendency. A different political parties that dominated the scene for a long time are in an advanced state of collapse, and new ones are emerging, which you can see in what's happening with the World Socialist website and the growing influence and authority of our parties, the Socialist Equality parties, in every single country.
As you said, that we always held that the fight to defend Assange was always bound up, not only with a fight to defend democratic rights, but in the building of a mass socialist anti-war movement, and you said that this is going to become a major issue in the working class. It is on that basis as well. I mean, I think something that will perhaps not have surprised people, but shocked and repulsed them, is that even under these conditions of a terrible pandemic, the United States in particular has not let up and has in fact its war drive and has in fact made an ally of the virus as a weapon of war against some of its enemies, in terms of the continuing of sanctions against Venezuela and against Iran, with unknown potential casualties flowing from that. There are a couple of questions which we've had in, which are on a related point, which I think we could address now, which refer to the developing campaign in the West's media against China. One viewer writes in, as we know from previous experiences, political, social and economic crisis at home requires an external enemy to externalize it even when one does not exist. It would appear the Chinese regime now finds itself in a similar situation to that which Saddam Hussein's regime found itself prior to the Second Persian Gulf War. Given the US administration's insistence on promoting the anti-China narrative of the false relation between the lab in Wuhan and COVID-19, is what we are seeing in particular from the side of the United States a conscious decision to further raise the escalation of war preparations against China? And a second question, which asks us to address the accusations of Trump against China for crimes against humanity surrounding the release of the virus, but simultaneously Trump's removing of funding from the World Health Organization for favoring China, despite the fact, as the questioner says, they are one of the only institutions carrying out an effective fight against the pandemic.
Well, the point about it is that that's perhaps the greatest of many abominations, is that they're using the coronavirus pandemic to step up trade and military war. At a very time when the common fate of humanity the fact that we all rely on each other is burning itself into the consciousness of broad mass of the population. You have political criminals like Trump and his coterie, but not just Trump, certainly the Johnson government, who are now saying that, you know, really the main thing is to step up an international campaign targeting in particular China. I agree with everything you said about Venezuela and Iran. You know, it's a common thing, you know, Trump saying that Iran's lied and all the rest, but this really is focusing on China, and it's focusing on China not simply because that's where the pandemic began, but because that China is seen as a major global competitor to the United States, and they're very clear about this. Now, what they're using is so cynical. I mean, they're speaking about this institution in Wuhan, I forgot what the name is. I've got here. Shi Zhengli. They call her the Batwoman because she specializes in studying viruses that begin in animal populations and then spread into the human population, with particular reference to bats. And so she's based in Wuhan, as is her institution. Now, when she's doing these investigations into these connections, and then there's a pandemic that you see, the virus is in fact crossed into the human population from animals, and they don't know what's caused it. You know, there's some speculation it comes from this live market in Wuhan. As a responsible scientist, she says, is there any possibility that this could have come out of my laboratory? And they launch a major investigation, and she concludes that the evidence from simply a timeline refutes a connection between her laboratory and the outbreak in Wuhan. And she breathes a sigh of relief, only somewhere down the line for Donald Trump and his filthy supporters to make out that this is proof positive that this was a virus engineered in China and released into the population in order to, I know, various reasons for it, prove the superiority of the Chinese system. I mean, just the wildest stuff, but that's not stopping it from developing because there's a need for it. I mean, you've made the point, you know, it's become something of a cliche within the World Socialist website, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, this is one use for the crisis, which is to legitimize and justify trade and military war. And that is not just simply directed against their opponents. I read, and I apologize before I even do it, I can't apologize enough, but I'm going to quote Jeremy Clarkson in the Times. Now, this is not, no one wants to quote Jeremy Clarkson. However, it has the advantage of being, because he's such a brutal thug of an individual, you know, and as the comedian Stuart Lee pointed out, it's only a joke. But this is what he says in his Sunday Times column this week. His title, "We Definitely Can't Blame the Germans This Time, so wealthy second homers get a kick in instead." He says in this piece, and I'm paraphrasing like mad because it's a long diatribe, as one would assume from this man. He says the lockdown is not bringing out the best in people. The lockdown is turning most people into monsters. And why are they monsters? It's because there's been criticism of Gordon Ramsay, the chef, Rita Ora, the pop star, David Beckham, the ex-footballer, and the Queen for going to their second homes and he finds this outrageous, that there's a populist streak in this. They're targeting the rich. There's a sentiment against the rich developing, and he says, the big problem is that when the pandemic is over, things will get much worse. As millions emerge blinking into the light to find that they have no food, jobs, pension, or savings, anger will mold their bitterness into a petrol bomb, especially now that petrol is so cheap. He then complains, going on from that, in addition, literally everyone wants government cash. And he says, and literally everyone isn't going to get it. He then says, some people think it basically resorts to the magic money tree argument that people think there's just unlimited cash. And then he says, others who have a slightly, in brackets, better understanding of fiscal issues will say the problem can be addressed by taxing the rich. He says, because there are so many people like this out there who think the rich should be taxed, and because social media gives them a voice, this government will not survive the post-virus apocalypse. And Q. Keir Starmer, he says, we are told that 2 million could lose their jobs, but it could be 4 million. It could be 6. We've already seen footage from Italy of enraged families trying to kick their way through the supermarket's windows, and it's likely this will happen here too. And this is his conclusion. To prevent this kind of social meltdown, it's imperative we find someone to blame for all our problems. And he concludes, in the First and Second World Wars, there were unimaginable hardships, but the country was united because everyone knew who was to blame: the Germans. All our negative energy was focused on them, not one another. Sadly, these days, it is considered racist to blame a country and its people and their penchant for eating wildlife. But I think it would be healthier for everyone if we could. Now, that stripped of all the highfalutin stuff summarizes the purpose and function of xenophobia and anti-Chinese xenophobia in particular in the current climate. They know that social tensions have reached breaking point, that there's going to be a challenge, that governments will not survive, that social antagonisms will erupt and take an explosive form, and they are seeking to mobilize people and redirect tensions away and out towards China, Iran, Venezuela, immigrants, call it what you will. But I will say this, that the sentiment that exists in the working class is not that. The sentiment that he identifies in his crude, right-wing, typically filthy way dominates in the working class. There's a feeling that capitalism has been exposed and that something more equitable, more humane must emerge. And it's our task to give that direction. And there's every indication that that is becoming an increasingly powerful sentiment in the working class, that it's a sentiment that will grow, and provided that we give it conscious expression, that our tendency is emerging and will emerge increasingly as a very powerful political force in not just the British, but the international working class.
I agree completely. And in fact, Clarkson undersells his argument, because the monstrous population also went after those saints, Mike Ashley, who tried to claim that tennis shoes were essential items and bring his workforce back into unsafe conditions. And I forget the owner of Wetherspoons, who channeled the spirit of Marie Antoinette and told his workers that they were all sacked and that they could at least not go and eat cake, but go and get a job at Tesco's. And the fact is, and the important point about this is that there was a strong reaction to this, and a general developing sentiment that the masters of the universe, that the billionaire class, are far from being some sort of the pioneers of society, and the ones who drive it forward are the parasites on it. And as you said, this is creating an explosive social sentiment that was referred to in, I believe, an article in Bloomberg, which we made reference to in one of our perspectives on the World Socialist website, that this would become a trigger for social revolutions all over the world. And in that context, I just want to bring up, because it raises one of the threats in this situation. And then from that, I think we can get on to what our response and our program is. But the threat that's raised through the question that comes in that says, my fear is that it seems that some measures taken under the guise of coronavirus are the very right-wing measures that have been touted by the ruling class across Europe, if in fact these measures become the new normal and aren't reversed. Closed borders, no migration, further police powers, no public gatherings or strikes, further controls, and the rise of fascism in response to inadequate accommodation and basic supply of healthcare and food. I mean, how would you respond to this as a concern, and how do we, as the Socialist Equality Party, respond?
Anyone who's not concerned with that has missed the narrative. I mean, this is a very real threat to the working class. There is no going back from this. We're not looking at the end of a crisis in which there's a return to normality. There's a new normal. None of the powers which the ruling class has accrued to itself, they're going to say, all right, now we no longer need them. They're going to use those powers against the working class. You know, the police, the measures against social distancing, telling people to stay in their homes, will then be used to send people to work, etc., etc. But we're not. I mean, I was accused. I did an interview this week. My interviewer said, "Well, you're very optimistic." Well, you can't be a socialist and not be optimistic, because, and it's not a mood anyway. We base ourselves on an historically determined understanding of the role played by the working class within capitalist society, a class which at the moment is exploited, but given political leadership, becomes the most powerful social force the world has ever seen. We are as aware as anyone of the dangers emanating from the ruling class. But unlike every other tendency that's written off the working class, we don't share the position that workers are gullible, stupid, that they don't respond. The fundamental problem identified by Leon Trotsky, confronting the working class and therefore confronting humanity, was the crisis of revolutionary leadership. There's a perspective crisis in the working class. All of the perspectives which were championed in the past, based on various forms of regulating the national economy and securing social peace, have all been blown apart by the development of globalization and the descent of capitalism into an acute crisis. Something new is required, but it's not something new that needs to be invented. See, what do we represent in this situation? What does the Socialist Equality Party represent? What does the World Socialist website represent? We certainly give a voice to the sentiment that exists in the working class. You can see that in the article on Bournemouth, or on the postal workers dispute, or the disputes in Amazon, or the innumerable interviews that have been conducted in one country after another. We turn to the working class. We seek to give that a voice, give it expression, but we do so from the standpoint also of addressing a political perspective to the working class. And there's a growing audience for it. I mean, we discussed about the readership of the World Socialist website. You know, just a side. Sorry about this. Should have really printed this out. But the audience for our perspective is getting bigger all the time. According to Alexa, which is the authority considered to be the authoritative account of these things, the World Socialist website is ranked 15,323rd in global internet traffic and engagement. In the UK, its ranking is 1,554th. That's an incredible situation. If you consider that the Labour Party's website is 207,406th in its global ranking. Jeremy Corbyn is so low in his ranking that there are no comparable statistics available. Alexa ranks him as 2,420,250th, and that is a fall of 500,000 over the last 90 days. Our left-wing competitors, for want of a better term, the Socialist Party and Socialist Workers' Party, barely figure. Now, we know at this point we are a small political tendency, you know, but all of the indications are not simply because we're optimistic, but all of the indications are that as this crisis develops, there develops a growing audience for the program and perspective associated with the Trotskyist movement and defended historically by the International Committee and embodied in the World Socialist website, the Socialist Equality Parties and our cadre. And those who are listening today who aren't members should think about that very seriously. Because if there's a recognition, for example, whoever asked the question, of the dangers that are pregnant within this situation, then what is the answer? If you're in danger, you prepare to confront that danger. And confronting that danger requires the building of a new political leadership in the working class. And that leadership is the SEP.
And just following on from those obviously very important points, a viewer asks, in spite of pressure from the trades unions on workers to carry on regardless in deadly working conditions in order to safeguard the economy from total collapse, there is a growing resistance in the working class to continue working in these conditions, and also a resistance to the end of social isolation, to a premature end of the public health measures, and a resistance to that call to return to work. How can this resistance be taken forward? Obviously, we've articulated a series of demands on the World Socialist website. We've produced a number of very important perspectives which give a lead to the sort of political response that has to be taken. And we've addressed, as we've said, several key sectors of the workforce with a programme and with steps that can be taken to begin organising a movement of the working class that can resist this danger, as you've said. Perhaps as we're coming to our sort of closing time, you could elaborate what some of those demands are and how we have sought to respond to this crisis and encourage workers to do so.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all of our demands, whatever demand we place, has one overarching aim, which is to develop the independent political activity and initiative of the working class. And we don't do that by ignoring the present state of social relations. We live under capitalism. So we don't limit ourselves to local initiatives, you know, food banks, helping out in the community, which are all very good and necessary under certain circumstances. But what we say is that there is an absolute conflict between the interests of the broad mass of the population and the existing social and political system. There are vast amounts of money, resources, finance, everything that is required to combat COVID-19, to safeguard jobs, to develop and extend health provision, care for the elderly, pensions, all exist within society, but it's all monopolized by the ruling class. It owns the banks, it owns the corporations, it controls the governments. So we say to the working class, we put before the working class a series of demands that direct the working class to challenging and changing that situation. We say, take control of essential industries, strip the wealth from the oligarchy, bring production for need, not profit, a program of public works, guarantee the income of workers and young people for the course of this crisis. They say there's no money. There's plenty of money. They've been shoving it into the Federal Reserve in America, the Bank of England in Britain, the Germany's central bank, the European Union, Japanese banks. They've all been pushing money, endless supplies of money. Firstly in 2008, when the global crash took place, and now on an even bigger scale, they're using society's resources to prop up the financial oligarchy and secure their grotesque levels of personal and corporate wealth. We say, take that off them. Take control of society's wealth. Run industry and we've formulated a series of demands which are designed to address the working class to what is required in the reconstruction of society along socialist foundations. Demands that inexorably lead to the conclusion that the working class has got to take state power and implement a socialist system. And that is, but it's never from the standpoint of simply demanding others do. We're seeking the working class to become an independent political factor in political life and social life. Accompanying that, we make an absolute stress that you can't trust the Labour Party, you can't trust the Democratic Party, you can't trust the SPD, you can't trust Podemos, you can't trust Syriza, you can trust none of these parties. You cannot rely on the trade unions. The trade unions confront the working class as a hostile force. They are instruments of corporate management in the imposition of job losses, wage cuts, speed ups. So we call for the creation of rank and file committees in the workplaces, community organisations that develop the independent activity of the working class. But it all centres on one central task, which is the construction of a new leadership in the working class, a revolutionary party of the international working class. You cannot develop a genuine response to any of society's problems now on a national basis. Doesn't matter whether it's the coronavirus crisis, global unemployment, the impending economic catastrophe, the growing threat of war, environmental degradation. They all point to the need to organise on a global scale. The only class that can carry that forward and in doing so become a pole of attraction for scientists, academics, the more oppressed layers of the population, including the peasantry, is the working class, because it is the only international class with no interest in the existing system of exploitation and the division of the world into antagonistic nation states. So we advance at the center of everything we do the perspective of world socialism, of the revolutionary seizure of power by the working class and the transformation of society along socialist foundations of production, of planned production for need, not profit, that can utilize the enormous resources of the world to meet the essential requirements of the billions of people on this planet. And that type of political realignment is pregnant within this situation. But it has to be fought for. If I was going to conclude on anything, we're speaking to people on this meeting, I hope, who are somewhat familiar with what the World Socialist website stands for and what the Socialist Equality Party represents. Well, there are certain times when you have to take a decision to decide. If you agree with the perspective that we've outlined, if you understand the gravity of the situation now confronting workers in Britain, Europe, and internationally, then it requires that you dedicate your life to socialism, take your position within the Socialist Equality Party, fight for its resources. And I want to make a special appeal, and I know that we'll probably conclude on this, to join in and attend our International May Day meeting on May the 2nd, because we will outline the global international perspective that is represented by the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement, the World Party of Socialist Revolution.
Thank you, Chris. And we are, as you say, running up close to our 2-hour cutoff mark. Obviously, this isn't the end of the discussion. Some very crucial political issues have been raised here today, which I know those watching will think long and hard on. And now we, as Chris has said, would like to let you know about some key events and ways in which you can stay in contact with the work of the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website. As Chris has mentioned, in just under 2 weeks' time, on Saturday, the 2nd of May, 4 o'clock in the UK, our international movement is organising and streaming a May Day rally. Speakers from all over the world, leading figures in the socialist movement, will be giving presentations on every aspect of the coronavirus pandemic, and crucially, on the struggle of the international working class for its own independent socialist response to this crisis. Any fight back against what we've characterised as the malign neglect of the world's capitalist governments, and for a humane society which protects people's lives and livelihoods, begins at this event. We encourage all of you to make plans to attend, yourselves, of course, but also to invite any friends, family members, and colleagues, and to begin building the only movement which can offer a way out of the slaughterhouse that 21st century capitalism has become. We thank you very much for your attendance at what is a first attempt at an online meeting on our part. Thank you for bearing with us. We hope it came across well. And we, as we say, encourage you to continue the discussion on the Facebook page after we're gone. And we look forward to seeing you on the Saturday after next. Thank you very much, Chris, as well.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Bye-bye.